Hello everyone and welcome to today's program. Joining me in the studio today is Dr. Levon Gevorgyan. He is an international legal expert, and among a lot of his accomplishments, he currently advises the legal team representing the Republic of Armenia in its case against Azerbaijan in the International Court of Justice. We're going to be discussing some of the other cases that are also pending in international tribunals. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Gevorgyan, and welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Let's just talk about the case at the International Court of Justice. What is Armenia's case against Azerbaijan?
Right, so right after the war, Armenia notified the Republic of Azerbaijan about its intention to start negotiations within the scope of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Basically, Armenia is claiming that for decades, Azerbaijan has been conducting non-compliance with the obligations under international law, specifically that convention which prohibits states to spread xenophobia and racial discrimination. And at the outcome of the negotiations, when it was obvious that the negotiations are not going anywhere, Armenia has made the decision to take the case to the International Court of Justice. To be honest, it was long coming because essentially Azerbaijan has been acting in that way for decades for now, be that the destruction of the Armenian cultural heritage in Nakhichevan, be that the glorification of Ramil Safarov and making him, positioning him as a national hero of Azerbaijan, calling him an example for the Azerbaijani youth, and of course all the violations that took place both during the April War and then unfortunately also during the 44-day war, which are the war crimes, the displacement of civilian population, intentional targeting in certain situations, and of course, unfortunately, the various incidents, many incidents of torture and inhuman degrading treatment, which in essence amassed significant evidentiary material for the Republic of Armenia to file the case before the International Court of Justice, and that's where we are.
And it's still pending. Do we know if there's going to be some kind of a hearing about that?
So we basically had one provisional measure hearings a year ago, and that's a very initial stage of the hearings, because what it basically implies, the parties are submitting some requests to the International Court of Justice to apply certain provisional measures, like injunctions, just to compare with domestic legal proceedings. And Armenia managed to secure a number of injunctive measures, if I may say so, provisional measures that Azerbaijan has an obligation to comply with, which pertain to the obligation to preserve the cultural heritage, which pertain to the obligation to refrain from using ethnic rhetoric, ethnically degrading rhetoric, as well as an obligation to treat humanely the prisoners of war that Armenia still has, unfortunately, captive in Azerbaijan. But in the long run, the case is going to last at least a couple of years. So essentially, the upcoming deadline that the parties have is the submission of the memorials, which is going to take place at the early 2023. Then we, of course, anticipate another hearing, most probably during 2023. And most probably the case, depending on the circumstances, is going to last at least another 4 or 5 years.
Dr. Gevorgyan was in Los Angeles at the invitation of the Armenian National Committee of America's Western Region, which this weekend hosted its annual grassroots conference, where Dr. Gevorgyan was a panelist on this very topic. You have had extensive experience in representing Armenia in the various international tribunals, including as part of the team representing the relatives of Gurgen Markaryan, the soldier who was axed by an Azerbaijani in Hungary, and also the Perinchek versus Switzerland case, which we commonly refer to as the Armenian genocide case. Let's talk about the issues pending at the European Court of Human Rights at the moment. There were certain rulings, I would say, right after the war and also last year, but with the recent attack, there's also another case that's being presented by Armenia. Let's talk about those a little bit.
Right. So, European Court of Human Rights is pretty much now a battleground for various cases that the Republic of Armenia has filed and is still working on filing, because right during the course of the war, Armenia requested the interim measures for the European Court to apply, and it applied interim measures both with respect to Azerbaijan and Turkey, which, as a matter of fact, created a whole scandalous response from the Republic of Turkey, which apparently felt as if it's immune from any potential interstate judicial proceedings. But in any case, as the outcome of the war, Republic of Armenia filed two cases, one against Azerbaijan, one against Turkey, both covering the whole process of the 44-day war. Then, unfortunately, because we had further escalations during the past 2 years, which pertain to Nagorno-Karabakh, the situation where the Azerbaijani forces intentionally created certain circumstances for the local, negative circumstances for the local population, like cutting the gas pipeline, or damaging the electricity support, and also certain movements by the Azerbaijani forces also in the territory of Artsakh, which triggered another case being filed against Azerbaijan. Now Armenia is also working on a fourth actual case that is going to be filed against Azerbaijan, and that pertains to the actual incursions of the Azerbaijani forces into Armenia proper, which, as a matter of fact, create various violations of human rights, the displacement of the civilian population, the damaging of the civilian infrastructure, the fact that Azerbaijani forces also take over certain roads which are essential for the movement of the civilian population, and also for the healthcare and other basic for other basic needs. That creates a very significant, unfortunately, humanitarian situation, which we hope to address also before the European Court of Human Rights. So, in essence, yes, we have the proceedings before the International Court of Justice, and at least 3 cases before the ECHR pending as of now. Another case that is going to be submitted.
And on Monday, Azerbaijan asked for an extension from the European Court of Human Rights about submitting its list of Armenian prisoners of war, and they have until the 29th of September to submit that. When it comes to the treatment of the human rights violation, especially the treatment of prisoners of war, how does this court usually view the issues and make its judgments at the end?
Well, unfortunately, the preventive tools that are given to are within the hands of the courts are not that effective, right? So, essentially, the courts are usually coming up issuing the interim measure orders or the provisional measure orders in case of the ICJ, and those, in general, usually pertain to the obligation of human treatment. So, the country is basically imposed additionally, though it has the obligation in general, but the International Court would come and stress the necessity to treat prisoners of war humanely, and the final findings, of course, come when the whole judicial process ends. But unfortunately, when it comes to the anticipation that the International Court would actually order the return of the prisoners of war, that does not really happen. So we tried that venue before the International Court of Justice. The International Court of Justice, of course, indicated that its proceedings are limited to the nature of the convention that we're using to bring the case before the ICJ, which is the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, whereby the obligation to repatriate is something peculiar to the laws of war, which unfortunately do not have an instrument, a judicial, an international treaty or an instrument to bring the case before the international tribunal or in any international court. So we basically have to cope with the instrumentary that we have at hand and try to squeeze the maximum that we can do out of it.
I'm playing devil's advocate. Azerbaijan claims that it was not attacking Armenia in 2020, but rather setting a course within its own borders, with
Right.
respect to Artsakh. How does that approach impact any type of a decision that these international tribunals would take?
That's a very good question. Well, essentially, in terms of the proceedings that we initiated, because again, the format of the proceedings, it pertains essentially to the racial discrimination. And the nature of the dispute, whether it's a territorial dispute, whether it's a self-determination issue, whether it's a secessionist movement, whether it's actually the narrative that Azerbaijan is trying to push forward, that it's the Republic of Armenia that is the aggressor state, that is in control of this puppet entity, which is Artsakh, and has been occupying the Azerbaijan lands for decades. It doesn't really matter before the ICJ, because the nature of the dispute would be important if the case pertained to the use of force, whether the use of force was justified or not. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the fact that Azerbaijan for decades has been spreading anti-Armenian xenophobia and anti-Armenian hatred. That's been for decades destroying Armenian cultural heritage and fabricating the history. That for decades the public officials of the Republic of Azerbaijan at the highest level were spreading hatred that would be peculiar to the Nazi Germany of late 30s and early 40s, and of course the Azerbaijani narrative and its vision of the dispute does not really affect the human rights violations it has committed. It is important that, of course, and we need to stress that in terms of politics, Azerbaijan has significantly managed to push forward its own narrative, its own vision of the conflict, and the vision. That's a short description of the conflict that I presented a couple of minutes ago, where they claim that Armenia is the aggressor state, etc., etc. Unfortunately, it was prevalent and was pretty much something that the international community, unfortunately, was very receptive of, and that, to a certain extent, also, of course, affected the reaction of the international community when the war started. And from that perspective, this case is, to a certain extent, is also an important attempt to break that narrative, to present the actual realities to the international community, to make the international community understand what they are indeed dealing with, and what they are dealing with is a racist regime existing during the 21st century, and the international community is pretty much ignorant as of now and trying to close a blind eye on that fact. The international proceedings and the final judgment that we try to seek before the International Court of Justice is basically aimed at breaking that unfortunate situation and opening the eyes forcefully, to a certain extent, of the international community and showing them that what Azerbaijan really is.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the poignant things, and I think it was you on your panel that brought up on Saturday, was that throughout the past 30 years, Azerbaijan has systematically essentially bombarded these foreign governments with its own narrative, and they have stuck, while Armenia, and I covering this thing for the last 30 years, I've also noticed, was far behind or even lacking. And now it seems like Armenia is playing catch up. How is that going to impact the cycle that's been created in this process?
Right. So we, of course, can talk and try to speculate as to why Armenia has failed to respond to that narrative building for the past decades. Most probably it's the unreasonable reliance on the OSCE Minsk process, which Armenia seemed to treat as the sole guarantor of the security in the region, while trying to avoid any other fora and any other international organizations and any other platform to develop its own narrative or to counter the Azerbaijani narrative. But as you correctly said, things are changing now, and Armenia is trying to catch up with what it had failed to do for the past decades, which I believe is a very important development because, of course, issues are primarily being determined on the front lines, but this is a backup to all the policies that the government is developing. So it's part of the nation building, it's part of the exercise of the sovereignty, and it's basically a battle that has to be fought not only on the battlegrounds but also in the judicial institutions and before international organizations. Otherwise we will fail.
And I also think that perhaps successive governments saw that, for example, in the diaspora organizations like the ANCA Western Region and other advocacy organizations in Europe and the Middle East are kind of carrying that burden within the legislature, and they thought that this is going to somehow go into the international justice system, but that's not how really advocacy works.
There has to be a concerted effort from Armenia, from communities within the diaspora. If judicial proceedings are going to, if we try to capitalize on those judicial proceedings, it's we are supposed not to simply wait for the international courts to come up to render the judgments. What we're supposed to do is to commit extensively to that narrative building, prepare significant grounds for that judgment, for that final judgment to be utilized in the most optimal way, so that Armenians and Armenia can benefit. Of course, we're not, when we're going to the International Court of Justice, the judgment in itself is not the ultimate goal. The primary question is, how are you going to use that judgment? If 5 years from now there is a judgment saying that Azerbaijan is a racist regime, how do you capitalize on that? How do you talk to the international community having that trump card in your hands? Of course, what is the obvious thing is that Armenia is supposed to talk to the international community saying that the existence of the Armenian community in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Artsakh, within the boundaries of a state that is obviously a racist regime is impossible, right? But at the same time, of course, we also need to be cognizant and need to understand that the proceedings are going to last a couple of years, and we also need to commit to that narrative building until up until the moment those judgments start to arrive. Because again, let's be honest here, we have a rather problematic situation. We have a situation where the mandate of the peacekeepers is going to last in 3 years from now, and we have proceedings which are going to last longer than that. So Armenia and Armenians all over the globe are primarily, first of all, need to solve this very expedient issue: how to secure how to deal with the security of the Armenian population in Artsakh until the judgments start to arrive. And of course, there's a hell lot of work to do in that respect.
And you kind of touched on it. Let's speculate that all of these cases that Armenia has in the various international courts is going to be ruled in Armenia's favor. Right. How are these courts going to kind of impose on Azerbaijan to follow its ruling?
Yeah, that's one of the most difficult issues of public international law is its enforcement, because unlike the case of domestic courts where you have the enforcement bodies that come and force the delinquent party to comply with the case, with the judgment, we don't have that under public international law. So at the end of the day, the whole enforcement mechanism is also done through international organizations and through bilateral relations that states build. So Armenia needs to be extremely active, talking to its international partners and probably even asking them to impose some certain sanctions against a state that is failing to comply with its international obligations under certain judgments and with the judgments of the international courts. Bring the issue to international organizations. And of course, the diaspora also has a lot of work to do there as well, because they are the shortcut to the domestic legislators, to local governments, and that's a unique tool that Armenians have compared to many other nations which don't have the extensive diaspora that Armenians do have. So as I said, we cannot expect the judgments, we cannot expect that someone is going to bring the judgment wrapped in a box and that is going to save our lives. We need to do an extensive work, both on the governmental level, both within the diasporas and various communities all over the planet that Armenians have, and hopefully we're going to come to that final outcome that we're hoping for.
And you've just kind of hit the nail on the head because when we talk about Armenia diaspora relations, again, in the past 30, 31 years, it's been sort of esoteric. Armenia has kind of been trying to hold diaspora at arm's length.
Right.
Happy if they, build a school or a, whatever church
Right.
or whatever, but don't engage in our everyday things, which unfortunately has brought us
Where
here.
we are, yeah.
So how do we sync that? Who is responsible to, for example, engage the diaspora in this legal processes?
The government, of course, first of all. So the government has to be extremely proactive and understand that it's a unique resource that is given, and you have an obligation to utilize that resource. So I do understand for decades Armenia has been treating the diasporas all over the world in a rather negative, let's say in a rather one-sided manner. Looking at those rather as to sources of investments rather than as into resources that you're supposed to invest into. And that is, of course, we can go into a lot of criticism, and that is going to switch the topic into politics, but I agree with you completely. There has to be a concerted effort from the side of the government, tireless work to restore the relations with various communities. I understand the relations are damaged to a certain extent after the war, and there's a lot of work to do in that respect.
And there's also a lot of work from a legal perspective that needs to go into this whole issue that crept up on November 9th, 2020, which is the delimitation and demarcation of the borders. Mm-hmm. And I'm sensing that every time an official from Yerevan is making a statement, it's kind of off the cuff, where there has to be succinct legal components that are involved in that. What is this process for our audience to understand exactly what delimitation and demarcation is, and what are the legal challenges in
right.
that?
So, of course, I'm not a state official. I cannot talk on behalf of the government because I'm only an external advisor to the team before the international courts. Armenia has, of course, committed to the delimitation and demarcation process, but first of all, what you correctly stressed, Armenia for decades has lacked any precise legal doctrine or policy as to where its actual borders are. And let's be honest, Armenia has never ever been even clear about the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. Is it part of Armenia? Is it a self-determination group? Statements of various government officials have been very contradictory during the past 30 years. And my personal understanding is that Armenia, first of all, has to start with the clear-cut development of the clear-cut legal doctrine that it's also supposed to present to the international community. Azerbaijan is pressing extensively and intensively on adherence to the Soviet administrative borders. So the position of Azerbaijan is that Armenian and Azerbaijani border has to be determined based on the Soviet border, which existed at the moment, at the late 80s when the and early 90s when the conflict started and when the Soviet Union collapsed. Is that approach in the interests of the Republic of Armenia? Of course not, because Azerbaijan is also using that argumentation to claim that Nagorno-Karabakh has to be dealt as an Azerbaijani territory. Does the claim that Azerbaijan is coming up with have any value under public international law? Well, that can be questioned. That can be questioned because because what Azerbaijan is referring to, it's basically referring to the history of decolonization that happened during in Latin America and also in Africa. They claim that since in Latin America and in Africa, borders between newly independent states have been determined based on the administrative borders that existed during the colonial periods. We need to do the same here in case of Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia has failed to come up with a very precise and defined legal doctrine as to why we should agree with that or why we should not agree with that. Statements coming from various public officials, unfortunately, are not very promising in that respect. But also we can argue that many of those statements are being made under distress and under the threat of force that the Republic of Armenia is constantly basically going through, because it is very obvious that for the past 2 years, the Republic of Armenia has been acting under the constant threat of force, sometimes direct use of force, and that, of course, to a certain extent begs the question whether the statements of those state officials could qualify as legitimate statements of state officials, or whether those should be discredited as concessions made under the threat of force. So we definitely lack there. Armenia definitely has to develop a uniform position on its own understanding of its borders. Let's not elaborate on that more in detail, because that's gonna take us into a completely different direction, and that will take us at least a couple of hours.
But the obvious thing, the elephant in the room, obviously, is if you're going by the Soviet borders, and also just today on Monday, the Prime Minister, while he was visiting Emmanuel Macron, the President of France, reiterated that these border things happened in 1991 because we recognized each other's territorial integrity. The elephant in the room is the Soviet borders artificially place Karabakh, Artsakh within Azerbaijan. So how are you going to transcend that situation?
What the Prime Minister is referring to is the founding treaties of the CIS. And I will completely disagree with him on whether those are restatements of the Soviet borders. What those documents basically talk about is the principle of territorial integrity, which has nothing to do with how you define your borders. Well, just to be more clear on that, the principle of territorial integrity comes to apply at the moment when you already have a determination as to where the borders go through, right? So the principle of territorial integrity does not tell that this cup belongs to me and that paper belongs to you. The principle of territorial integrity applies only when there is a determination that this cup belongs to me and that piece of paper belongs to you. So referring to the principle of territorial integrity as a confirmation of adherence to the Soviet borders, I think it makes rather no sense under public international law, and hopefully at some time our political leadership will have the power and the capacity to come up with the sustained and concerted, policy as to where we think Armenia's borders lie.
I'm not a legal expert, however, I can sense that this delimitation and demarcation process is not something that can happen overnight. There has to be. How long do you think the process will take?
Well, Armenia is in a delimitation process with Georgia, which has been in place for decades now, right? So naturally, a delimitation and demarcation process is going to last for years at least. If it lasts shorter than that, that begs the question whether that delimitation was one-sided or not. And we'll see how it goes.
And also, I want to come back to especially the ICJ for a moment. We talked about, the rulings can come as precedents that can be used in international negotiations or relations. How about those countries that are not members of the ICJ, or, for example, after the Ukraine situation, Russia essentially left ICJ. So
ECHR. They left ECHR.
Okay. But anyway, how about those countries that are not part of these groups?
When it comes to the International Court of Justice, since it's the primary judicial organ of the United Nations, we can pretty much say that the whole planet is a member.
Yeah.
Well, with the exception of probably North Korea, I believe they are not a member of the UN as of now. With the ECHR, of course, things are a bit more complicated, but the ECHR ECHR, as a judicial body of the Council of Europe, has its own tools and leverages to be imposed, that can be imposed against states that are not compliant with those. Those can be, basically, if a state fails to comply with those, the ultimate tool that a Council of Europe can apply is basically kicking the country outside of the organization. In case of the International Court of Justice, the Charter of the United Nations provides for the possibility of bringing the matter to the Security Council. If a country fails to comply with the judgment of the ICJ, it can be brought before the Security Council. To my memory, it has been done twice during the history of the past 60 years. One of the reasons for that is that states usually tend to comply with the judgments of the ICJ because of its reputation, because of the because of the value that this judicial organ has. There are very few cases where states would simply fail to comply with the judgment and say that's what we do.
I'm also very encouraged that the folks representing Armenia and the legal team is a very young, professional generation. How did you get involved in this? I'm interested to know because your resume is so extensive. And
basically, when I did my master's degree in the United States in Washington, D.C., and after I returned, I've been working, of course, in the private sector, not in the public sector, but since my education was in public international law, I was very keen to somehow utilizing my knowledge in public international law and making it useful for the benefit of the state in some way, mostly in pro bono initiatives, involvement in various cases before the European Court of Human Rights. So I and a group of friends of mine, which have public international law background, Yersha Kirakosyan, who is the representative of the Republic of Armenia before the international courts right now, have been lobbying for using this international instruments for years now. Unfortunately, we came to the situation where we initiated and filed the cases only after the war. We had to lose a lot of our lands to come to the realization of how important these tools are. But I don't want to be pessimistic. I don't want to say that everything is lost. There is still a possibility to amend this.
And perhaps there's also a window of opportunity for diaspora Armenians who are looking to go into law and international law. Tell us how they can kind of impact this process.
There is a network actually of a lot of lawyers within the diaspora, especially in the United States, who advise the team from time to time on various issues. There are certain lawyers who initiate cases before U.S. courts, raising awareness in the United States. Some lawyers also have been advocating bringing the matter of the discrimination before the UN Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. And the committee quite recently came up with a very extensive report on violations by the Republic of Azerbaijan. And to a large extent, that report was also the product of the activity of the American-based lawyers who represented on a pro bono basis filed various reports with the committee and also presented made appearances and interventions before the committee, and here we are. So it's a good example. The report that the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination issued a couple of months ago is a good example where the concerted effort from lawyers within diaspora can bring up effective outcomes that are good for Armenia and Armenian communities in general.
Any final thoughts?
No, I think I can only thank you for the invitation, and the whole set of events that we went through creates a lot of motivation to move forward, and I'm very happy to see that even though that we would think that there was a certain divide between diaspora and Armenia, after the war, the gap is becoming smaller, and we can unify our efforts once again.
I feel like the initial shock, I'm not saying is wearing off, but people are realizing that it's time to work, and your work certainly is critical in this process and other processes that are coming up. We wish you the best. We will be following this as they mature in these cases, and we will be looking to you for expertise and advice. Thank you so much,
Thank you so much.
Dr. Gevorgyan. And thank you all for tuning in. I'll see you again next time.